some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
This hour, because there's been a development in the search for Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie.
There are some puzzling new developments tonight in the ongoing search for Nancy Guthrie.
Nancy Guthrie's home. That story was written in droplets, smears, and patterns that would reveal the terrifying final moments before an elderly woman vanished into the night. This is the forensic reconstruction of an abduction. This is what happens when a former FBI profiler examines evidence that most people walk past without understanding. This is the moment we discover what Nancy Guthrie endured before she disappeared. I'm diving deep into the blood spatter evidence that investigators found outside Nancy's front door. Evidence that has been analyzed frame by frame by Jim Clemente, a former FBI profiler whose decades of experience have taught him to read violence like a language. What he discovered in those patterns challenges what many assumed about this case and reveals a struggle that was both brief and devastating. If you're interested in understanding how forensic science reconstructs violent crimes and what evidence can tell us about the people we're still searching for, you're going to want to stay with me through this entire analysis. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to Crime Case Analyst, because we're going deep into the evidence, the science, and the behavioral patterns that could help bring answers to cases like this one. Let's start with what we know for certain. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home during the night. According to her daughter Savannah, Nancy was taken from her bed by an intruder. The investigation revealed blood evidence, but here's what makes this case particularly unusual. The blood was found only outside the front door of Nancy's residence, not inside the bedroom where she was reportedly taken from, not in the hallway, not near the threshold of the front door. Only outside, on the walkway leading away from her home. This detail is critical because it tells us something about how Nancy was controlled from the moment the offender made contact with her until the moment she ended up bleeding on that walkway. It tells us that for at least part of this abduction, Nancy was compliant, moving from her bedroom to the front door without physical resistance that would have left blood evidence inside the home. Jim Clemente examined video footage of the blood evidence scene, going through it frame by frame to isolate specific patterns and extract every piece of information those patterns could provide. Blood spatter analysis relies on understanding the physical properties of blood, particularly its viscosity, the way it behaves when it leaves the body, and how it interacts with surfaces when it lands. These properties create patterns that are consistent and predictable, which means they can be read and interpreted with significant accuracy. The footage revealed two distinct blood spatter patterns on the walkway outside Nancy's front door. These patterns were close together, indicating they were created within a short time frame, possibly seconds or minutes apart. Between these two patterns, something happened. Some action took place that connects them in a sequence of events, and understanding that sequence is key to understanding what Nancy experienced. The first pattern Clemente analyzed was located more toward the center of the visible walkway area. Within this pattern, investigators could identify both larger droplets of blood and smaller droplets of blood. To the right of this central pattern, there was what appeared to be a smear, which indicated that blood had already been deposited on the surface, and then something or someone had disturbed it, moving through it or touching it after the fact. Blood spatter evidence is categorized by velocity. Low-velocity spatter consists of larger droplets that typically result from blood dripping under the force of gravity. Medium-velocity spatter creates smaller droplets and usually results from some force being applied to blood, such as being coughed or beaten. High-velocity spatter produces very fine, almost mist-like droplets, and is typically associated with gunshot wounds or explosive trauma. When Clemente examined a close-up still image of the center pattern, he identified characteristics of both low and medium velocity spatter. This combination told him several things simultaneously, each detail adding another piece to the reconstruction of what happened on that walkway. First, The presence of medium velocity spatter indicated that Nancy's blood had been expelled with some force. This wasn't simply blood dripping from a wound. This was blood that had been pushed out of her body through some mechanism that created pressure and movement. Second, and perhaps most disturbing, some of the blood spots in this pattern were hollow. They appeared as rings rather than solid circles. This particular characteristic is the signature of aspirated blood, blood that has been mixed with air inside the respiratory system and then expelled. When these air-filled droplets hit a surface, the bubbles burst, leaving behind only the outer ring of blood. This meant Nancy was coughing up blood. The implications of aspirated blood are significant from a medical standpoint. Blood in the respiratory system that is then coughed out indicates trauma to the face, nose, mouth, or potentially internal injuries that caused bleeding into the airways.
The fact that Nancy was coughing this blood onto the walkway meant she was conscious. Her body was responding to that trauma, and she was in a position where that blood could travel from her mouth to the ground. Clemente's analysis of the directionality of the smaller droplets provided another crucial detail. Some of the droplets were elongated rather than circular, stretched in one direction. This elongation occurs when blood is moving in a particular direction when it strikes a surface. The degree of elongation and the direction of the tail on each droplet reveals the path that blood was traveling. In this pattern, the directional indicators weren't uniform. The blood had traveled in multiple directions, creating a scattered distribution rather than a straight line pattern. This multi-directional distribution is consistent with coughing, where blood is expelled outward from the mouth in various directions, rather than following a single trajectory. But here's where the analysis becomes even more specific and more chilling. The distribution pattern, the size of the droplets, and the presence of those telltale air bubbles all pointed to one inescapable conclusion about Nancy's position when this blood was deposited. Her face was within 1 foot of the ground. For blood to create the pattern that appeared on that walkway, With the distribution observed and the mixture of droplet sizes documented, Nancy's mouth had to be very close to the surface she was bleeding onto. Not standing, not sitting upright. Her face was approximately 12 inches or less from the concrete. Clemente assessed that Nancy was either hunched completely over, bent at the waist with her upper body folded down, or she was on her knees and hunched forward, or she was lying on the ground. However, the pattern itself suggested she was more likely in a hunched position rather than lying flat, based on the way the blood had dispersed. Think about what that position means. An elderly woman, taken from her bed in the night, who was walked from her bedroom to her front door, and then ended up hunched over on her own walkway, close enough to the ground that when she coughs, her blood spatters onto the concrete directly beneath her face. The larger droplets in the pattern, the ones that showed less directionality and appeared more consistent with low-velocity spatter, likely represented blood that dripped from her face after the initial coughing. Once the traumatic expulsion occurred, additional blood would have continued to flow from her injuries, dripping downward under gravity's pull. To the left of this central pattern, there was evidence of smudging.
Blood that had been deposited and then interfered with. Something had made contact with that blood after it landed, moving it, spreading it, disturbing its original pattern. Within the largest splotches in this area, Clemente identified directional tails pointing to the right. These tails appeared on multiple droplets, including one of the bubble-ringed droplets that indicated aspirated blood. The consistency of this directional indicator across multiple droplets in the same area reinforced the conclusion about Nancy's body position and orientation. Based on these directional indicators, Clemente determined that Nancy's body was positioned to the left of the image, which would place her toward the front door, with her head facing away from the door, but angled almost straight down toward the ground. The second major blood pattern that Clemente analyzed was located to the right of the first pattern in the original wide-angle view of the scene. This pattern showed the doormat to the left, providing a reference point for spatial orientation.
The second pattern contained more droplets of blood and more of those distinctive hollow circles that indicated air bubbles in the blood. At the top center of this pattern, 2 droplets and 1 bubble were visible. Slightly to the left in the lower portion, 1 droplet and 1 bubble appeared. To the right side, several more bubbles could be seen. And again, there was a smear pattern, indicating that blood had been deposited and then something had moved through it or across it, disturbing the original configuration. The presence of this second pattern, so similar in composition to the first, suggested that Nancy remained in that hunched or kneeling position for more than just a single moment. She was down, she was coughing blood, and she remained in that position long enough for multiple deposits of blood to accumulate in slightly different locations. But then the blood stops. The patterns end. There was no blood trail leading away from these 2 pattern areas. No drips, no smears extending down the walkway toward where a vehicle might have been parked. The story that the blood tells simply ends at this point on the walkway. Clementi's interpretation of this absence is as significant as the patterns themselves. When blood evidence abruptly stops in a location where an injured person was clearly present, it means that person was moved in a way that prevented further blood from dripping. Given that Nancy had facial trauma significant enough to cause her to cough up aspirated blood, that trauma would have continued to bleed. Wounds to the face, particularly the nose and mouth area, tend to bleed profusely. For the blood trail to stop where it did, Nancy would have had to be lifted and carried with her face positioned upward, preventing gravity from pulling blood down and out of her wounds onto the ground below. This wasn't Nancy walking away from this location. This was Nancy being carried away from this location by someone strong enough to lift her and controlled enough to reposition her body to minimize evidence. So what happened? How did a woman go from being taken from her bed to being hunched over and bleeding on a walkway to being carried away with no further blood evidence? Clementi's reconstruction of the event sequence is based on both the blood evidence and decades of experience in understanding how violent offenders operate, how they control victims, and what their behavioral patterns reveal about their methods. According to Savannah's account, Nancy was taken from her bed during the night. This means an offender entered her home, entered her bedroom, and made contact with her while she was in her most vulnerable state, asleep in her own bed, in the place where she should have been safest.